Hello, everybody. I'm Angelique Carlson, and this week we are discussing neurodevelopmental disorders. I'll be discussing autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. Autism spectrum disorder's onset is typically at 12 to 18 months, but may not be diagnosed until years later. When autism spectrum disorder is diagnosed, there are specific criteria to consider. First is that the condition can be traced to early childhood. Autism spectrum disorder does not need to be diagnosed at that age, but it does need to be able to track back to early childhood. This could be done through screening tools and interviews with caregivers and teachers. Diagnostic criteria are deficits in social reciprocity, nonverbal communication, and developing, maintaining, and understanding of relationships. Social reciprocity is the ability to share interests, emotions, and to participate in back and forth conversations. A deficit in nonverbal communication may look like a lack of eye contact and little to no body language. Clients may have a flat affect even when describing something that they enjoy or something that they find distressing. People with autism spectrum disorder may also be uninterested in friendships or have difficulty participating in imaginative play. As we discussed before, for a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, symptoms must be present in the early developmental period. However, symptoms may not manifest until increased social demands are present, and they can also be masked by learned strategy as the child ages. The symptoms must also cause substantial impairment in social and occupational areas in the client's life. Finally, we must rule out whether the deficits are caused by other conditions like intellectual developmental disorder or global developmental delay. One of the most important changes to the DSM-5 for people with autism is that multiple conditions were integrated under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. Conditions that previously stood alone, like Asperger's disorder, childhood disintegrative disorder, Rett's disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, also known as PDD-NOS. Under the current DSM-5, clinicians must specify if ASD occurs with or without intellectual impairment, with or without language impairment, is associated with a known medical condition, associated with another neurodevelopmental disorder, and with or without catatonia. Autism screening may begin with a broad developmental screening like the Ages and Stages questionnaire that pediatricians often use. But specific screening tools for an autism spectrum diagnosis are the MCHAT and the STAT, which provide clinical insight into whether a diagnostic might be warranted. My agency typically uses the CARS and then combines that with caregiver and child interviews and clinician observations to form an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. Autism spectrum disorder diagnosis prevalence in the United States can be limited by access to quality care as well as economic factors. However, the 2016 map gives you an idea as to where autism spectrum disorder is most prevalent. It is estimated that over 3.5 million Americans are currently diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and that ASD is primarily diagnosed much more often in men than women, about 4 to 1. But it is prevalent across all gender, racial, economic, and education groups. Neurodiversity is when we as a society respect someone's functional and behavioral traits. Accepting a client as they are supports the NASW core principle of dignity and worth of the person. Many people typically think of children when they think of autism spectrum disorder, but it's important to consider that children with an ASD diagnosis grow into adults. Services for children with ASD are more readily available than services for adults with autism spectrum disorder. There's a lack of information as to what services are available for adults, a lack of service provider communication, and a lack of systemic support during the transitional phase from childhood to adulthood, which often results in increased stress for clients and their families. In fact, caregivers of people with ASD report an increased burden of care, not only emotionally but financially through the transition. Many adults with ASD are turned away from support services for not meeting their cognitive threshold for assistance in adulthood, although they met the threshold throughout their childhood. When services are dropped for adults with ASD, they often disengage from society. Another concern is the burden of responsibility placed on adults with ASD. Being forced to sign a lease to live in a parent's apartment or added to car insurance for a car that they can never drive adds to their anxiety. As clinicians, we must work to understand the best practices in working with adults with an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. This includes research into the transitional needs for adults with ASD, but especially in health, mental health, gender and sexual identity, social development, vocational engagement, quality of life, and community services. To advocate for consistent transitional programming and funding to empower clients' engagement in social relationships, education, and the workplace. Most importantly, to respect their neurodiversity. In the next decade, the number of adults with an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis will double. Over 50% of adults diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder have an average or above average intelligence. However, more than 80% are unemployed and cite that employment is their most significant concern. Workers with ASD are often very hardworking, detail-oriented, have extraordinary memory, and are honest and reliable. As social workers, we can empower clients with autism spectrum disorder to market those skills and work to make employers aware of the significant benefits of hiring an employee who has an autism spectrum disorder. It's important to help employers understand that it's illegal to discriminate against people with autism spectrum disorder, and to remember that under the Americans with Disabilities Act, employers are required to accommodate disabilities like ASD by federal law. In fact, here are just a few companies recognizing the benefits of hiring employees with autism spectrum disorder. Accommodations like quiet spaces, headphones, and environmental control are helpful for people who are diagnosed with ASD. But even more helpful are flexible start times to accommodate routines, a mentor to help navigate workplace culture, and a company emphasis on written communication to ensure understanding between coworkers. These cost little to nothing to ensure that the workplace is less stressful for employees with ASD. Though there are companies now interested in hiring workers with autism spectrum disorder, it's still crucial for social workers to advocate for appropriate accommodations in the workplace for employees with autism spectrum disorder, and to cultivate a culture of acceptance in our neighborhoods, universities, and the workplace as the number of adults on the spectrum grows. Thank you.